Hello, everybody. My name is Sarah LeFanu. I'm a biographer of Rose Macaulay, and my Dreaming of Rose, a biographer's journal, was published by Handheld Press last month. As I'm sure most of you know, Kat Macdonald, founder and managing director of Handheld Press, is herself a Rose Macaulay scholar. She edited the collection Rose Macaulay, Gender and Modernity, and has already brought back into print 3 Rose Macaulay titles: Potterism, Whatnot, and Non-Combatants and Others. We're here tonight for the launch of a 4th title, Personal Pleasures, Essays on Enjoying Life, annotated and introduced by Kat. So the format tonight is the usual one. That is, Kat and I will talk for 30 or 40 minutes about Rose Macaulay, and in particular these essays, Personal Pleasures, and then we'll open up the meeting for questions and contributions from you in the audience. So, to start off, so my first question or point to talk about. So, Kat, Rose Macaulay, as you say in your introduction, is now best known for her novels, but she wrote a great deal of non-fiction, both in book form and in short form. So I wonder if you could perhaps start off by giving us an idea of her non-fiction writing as a context for these essays.
Okay. Well, let's assume poems count as fiction. So Rose Macaulay's non-fiction didn't really begin until 1920, when she was already a mature woman. She was beginning a glittering career as a novelist, and she got taken on by a new women's magazine called Good Housekeeping to become a columnist. So she wrote a series of 6 magazine columns, jolly and sprightly and very witty and sharp and really quite feminist. And on the back of that, she got assignments as a newspaper columnist, as a commentator, as a pundit. And she kind of specialized in becoming the woman that the magazines and the newspapers went to when they wanted a feminist and intelligent response to a public question of the day. And a couple of times she was pitted against a leading male chauvinist to discuss, should women talk in public? Or I can't think of the actual quotations, but they would battle it out in the newspapers. So she became a public figure deliberately. So this was in parallel to writing basically a novel a year. And then she began to write longer pieces with more gravitas, more authority, about subjects that interested her. And I'm going to have to read from the book now, the back of the book, to tell you exactly what she did write in the way of non-fiction. Click, click, click. So, yes, we got a casual commentary, 1925. She'd written so much journalism, she collected it into a book called A Casual Commentary, which are nice short pieces. They're not as funny and as mature, if you like, as Personal Pleasures, but they're pretty good. And then we have Catchwords and Claptrap, which was published by the Hogarth Press. So Virginia Woolf and Leonard Woolf must have really liked this. And this is as an essay, a massive essay about language and linguistics and how words attract association. Then we have a very serious book called Some Religious Elements in English Literature. So she's definitely veering towards the Cambridge side. There's a biography of Milton in 1934. Then we have a very interesting and very funny anthology of quotations from the 16th and 17th centuries called The Minor Pleasures of Life. And then we have Personal Pleasures. And after that, she does an open letter to a non-pacifist for the Peace Pledge Union. That was 1937. The first biography of E.M. Forster, she was the one to write it, 1938. A wartime book, Life Among the English, which is in a very well-known series by Collins in 1942, trying to boost pride in Britain during the middle of the war. A book about going to Portugal in 1946. And then, yeah, that was pretty much it. Then, the Pleasure of Ruins. Pleasure of Ruins is a massive, thick doorstep of a book about travel, biography, and chasing castles that have fallen down. And there's a new field of studies called ruin studies, and this book is apparently a keystone text in it because she was one of the first modern writers to really talk and intellectualize about ruins. So all these books are going on at the same time that she's writing a novel a year until about the Second World War. After that, her novels kind of slowed down because she was over 60 by then, and tiring, I suppose.
So a very wide range of non-fiction, both kind of in style and in subject matter. So the book that came out in 1934, The Minor Pleasures of Life, which was an anthology of other people's pleasures, wasn't it? So I sort of imagine, I mean, I don't actually know, but I imagine that having compiled that and having enjoyed compiling that, that maybe she thought, okay, well, it's time for me to write about my personal pleasures.
Yeah, and there are definite overlaps.
Right. And also, I mean, that was, maybe we could move on to talk about kind of where she was, not only in her writing, but also in her life, because the 1930s was a decade for her of great happiness. I mean, certainly kind of until the final years of it, when war was looming on the horizon, and that kind of cast its shadow over everything. And she was kind of very, responded to that as she did to, to politics all around her. But actually the 1930s was a good time for her. I mean, she was kind of properly grown up. And I think maybe that kind of gave her the permission to think about her own personal pleasures. I don't know whether you think.
Well, I think that's entirely likely, because she had money, she had position, she had a very wide circle of friends, she had a long-standing private adulterous relationship with a married man, and he and she went off separately to meet up in foreign countries and have lovely, delicious holidays together. And it's a good time, as you say. And she was recognized as an authority in her own special fields, and that she was a radio reviewer. She was on a board of assessing the use of language for the BBC. She was writing for The Spectator all the way through the 30s as a sort of a random columnist. They had this thing, Time and Tide magazine had a column called Notes by the Way, which is a page-long feature written by a guest writer, and they would address 5 or 6 issues in this big page of magazine writing. And The Spectator had a similar thing, only about a quarter of the length. And Macaulay just kept churning these out and presumably got well paid for them. But I think it was a dilettante existence in terms of her writing nonfiction. There was no obvious focus. It was more how she wrote and what she conveyed of her own personality and her own outlook and her own system of values. That was what was valued by the media who paid her to write these things, because she would write about anything. You could tell her politics, and she was certainly anti-fascist, and she was quite rigid in her views about morality, even though she had a private affair of her own. But then she was getting older at the time, so it's complex.
Yeah. So so before we move on to talking about how she wrote, I mean, the style, her particular Rose Macaulay style, I think it might be quite nice to give people an idea of the range of pleasures that are covered in this collection, personal pleasures, and they include many, in her own words, of seemingly opposed diversions. That's a rather kind of wonderful Rose Macaulay phrase, I think.
Yeah.
Now, if you could kind of give us an idea of, of what they encompass, what they include.
Okay, well, I'll just read out a section from the middle bit at the end of the list of essays. So we have cinema, clothes, cows, departure of visitors, disbelieving, doves in the chimney, driving a car, Easter in the woods, eating and drinking, elephants in Bloomsbury, fastest on earth, finishing a book, fire engines, flattery, flower shop in the night, and flying. And then we have improving the dictionary, listening in, logomachy, meals out, New Year's Eve, not going to parties, playgoing, pretty creatures, reading and shopping abroad. So she's hopping about in a delightfully random way, and then suddenly you're plunged into some quite serious and very abstruse matters. And then the next one, she's hallucinating about seeing elephants walking down Bloomsbury. past Bloomsbury Square and wondering how did they get there and what would they find to enjoy in Bloomsbury Square. So, her sense of the ridiculous is absolutely embedded alongside her seriousness and her inquiring after knowledge.
And I think that she really appreciated the many contradictions that she felt within herself. I mean, she spoke once about the battling lizards inside her. And so that's why you have essays on parties and not going to parties, and on believing and on not believing. I mean, she felt that there were often, if not two sides to things, many sides to things. And she liked to explore, those different pathways that they took her down. One of the things that I think comes over very strongly in this collection is her love for the life intellectual and the life physical.
The life physical. It's funny, she was always held to be one of the great writers about swimming because she adored swimming. She swam in the Serpentine until she was a very old lady. So cold water swimming had no fears. When she was growing up as a child in Italy, she swam in the Mediterranean regularly because she lived on the seaside. But yet, I understand reading from your biography, there's a memory by Rosamund Lehman of towing Rose up and down in a private members club on a lilo in the pool because Rose couldn't actually swim very well.
I think that's marvelous, actually.
Yeah, it's just
that she loved it so much.
Yeah,
and yet wasn't very good at it. But you might actually say a similar thing about her driving that she absolutely adored.
Yeah, she loved driving. She really enjoyed being in cars, but she was an absolutely terrible driver and she got done for speeding at least twice. And she incorporates that into her fiction. There's a couple of essays about driving and choosing a car and talking about a car. And then at the end of her most famous novel, The Towers of Trebizond, there is a terrible car accident, which reads as though it was written from the life because she did have a very bad car accident with her lover. And on occasion she was up in court and she decided to use her real name, Emily Rose Macaulay, rather than Rose Macaulay. So when the newspaper report of the trial came out of her case for being a speeding driver, Emily Macaulay would not be connected with the well-known literary writer and columnist Rose Macaulay.
Yes, she had her feet on the ground then, didn't she?
Yes, she did. She knew what she was doing.
Yeah.
But and people would refuse to take lifts home from parties with her because she was such an appalling driver, especially after drinks, which is good sense.
And I think also that that people believed after Personal Pleasures came out that she herself was a pilot and could fly planes.
That was ridiculous.
An impression that she gave, which was completely inaccurate. I mean, she didn't actually pilot any planes.
No, and that account of flying is so realistic. I've been comparing it to other accounts, thinking, well, she knew about this and she's using that word right, and she knew the spelling of this word is consonant with the way it's used by pilots, but she must have been reading accounts and just copied her own as a game, as a way to fool her readers.
Which is something that she quite enjoyed doing.
So,
Kate, you mentioned swimming in the Mediterranean. Now there are a number of essays, 5 or 6 in this collection, which look back to her childhood on the Ligurian coast, southwest of Genoa. And well, I'd kind of quite like to hear what you think of those. I mean, they conjure up this marvelous,
they do,
happy time.
They do, and it's a happy time with nobody else in it apart from herself and her brothers and sisters. And as you point out in Dreaming of Rose, when you actually got to Venezia and saw what it was like and saw the photographic evidence of the time when Rose was living there with her family, it was a bustling seaside resort. So her writing about her childhood has edited it out, all the Italians pretty much, and just made it a blissful, paradisical pleasure ground for children. And the essay that I remember best is the one about canoeing, when she's on her canoe, the family canoe that the children shared, and she took it and paddled out into the sea and then got a bit frightened because the wash from a boat was tossing the canoe about, and she thought, I better get back to land. That reads It reads as a wonderful daydream interrupted by reality. And she does a very good job of interjecting the right amount of fear that an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old girl might have felt. And then you step back and think, good Lord, what's she doing out there on her own? A canoe so far from land in the middle of the sea, and there's boats going by. So you get a strong sense of bravery as well. It's a very clever trick. So you feel one thing, but then you realize intellectually, if I feel that, therefore these facts must also be true. And good Lord, that's an extraordinary situation.
And that essay, in fact, is also a means by which she conveys those fantasies that she had and that she writes about elsewhere, of being an explorer, a captain, kind of whatever, but basically a single man, a male figure in charge of a boat or landing on a desert island. And the idea that she had then that she could be all these things. So again, another example of, I mean, the reality that came to hit her when she got back to England was that as a girl, you know, she most certainly, those futures were not open to her. I think her father actually told her that. But it's very lovely to read those fantasies.
Yes.
Then you kind of imagine her having those fantasies as she's rowing the canoe out.
I wouldn't go so far as to say that she imagined herself to be a man. I would say she certainly imagined herself to be as good and as capable a person as a sea captain would need to be, as an explorer would need to be. But but that's just what a pre-adolescent girl would think, that it's me, the person, becomes the great hero, the great adventurer. I think all girls might feel this before the tyranny of sex rears its head, think, oh, good Lord, puberty. But yes, she had all these imaginary freedoms in her head, and then when she got back to England and long skirts and you have to behave in a ladylike way because this is the end of the Victorian period, that must have been a terrific shock for her. And she was the second oldest sister as well, so she would have had to set an example and not shame her brothers, never mind her parents. Suddenly, masses of responsibilities descended upon her.
Yes, I mean the other thing that's written out of her accounts of her childhood, idyllic childhood on the Ligurian coast, are actually the other children in the family. One of whom died while they were out there, and the remaining of those two, the younger siblings, the younger sisters, was excluded from the 5 in the essays that she writes in Personal Pleasures. I mean, it's the 5 always doing things, that is, the 3 girls and the 2 boys, but there's no mention of any other sisters there.
And that's really shocking. Yes, in your biography, it's quite horrific to realise how completely the 2 youngest girls had been excluded, and then the very youngest one died as a toddler, basically, which must have been terrible.
They were there.
Yeah. But then the very youngest one completely excluded pretty much for the rest of her life because of the age difference and because of this strange, not so much animosity, but maybe indifference. It's odd. It's very odd.
Very odd family dynamics.
Yeah, and none of them married.
No.
They're like the Benson brothers. None of them married.
Interesting. Yes.
And well, two died very young. The eldest daughter went into an Anglican convent. And then the sister, the last remaining sister who outlived them all, was she a nurse?
Yes,
I think she was a nurse. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, it's one of them. Yeah, Will went to Canada and farmed, and then what happened to him? Anyway, none of them married. There are no descendants of that branch of the Macaulays, which for 7 children, that's quite a difference.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? The other thing that strikes me reading these again now is the intensity of the nostalgia, and thinking that these essays were written 45 years after those experiences. I mean, I know that people do remember their childhoods with that kind of intensity, but this seems very much the case here. And she did write about Italy in some of her novels, but I think in some of the early ones, in particular, The Furnace, I think, and The Lee Shore,
the Lee Shore, appears
in those. And it appears briefly, I think, in Whatnot that Handheld Publishing.
Yeah, well, they have the great romantic moment. Yes,
that's right. Yes, the great romantic moment. But after that, not so much. And yet here she is, kind of remembering 40 or 45 years beforehand with this, this passion of
Yeah.
intensity for the joys of
Yeah.
the physical freedoms that they had and the intellectual curiosity that they experienced, and that's kind of where her reading starts as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, I think, Kate, actually, I think maybe let's go on and talk about the style of these essays, this kind of particular style. So, so what do you say? I love this. What you say in the introduction is that these pleasures, many of which, not all of them, but many of them are really quite ordinary pleasures, are conveyed to us through, and to quote you, a palimpsest of dense allusions and quotations.
Yes.
The collection itself was published without any notes and references, and you have done this incredible job, basically, of annotating them and finding the references, finding the attributions. So, okay,
it took me weeks.
What was that like? Okay, tell us.
Absolute weeks. Normally, I write all the notes for the handheld books because it's one of my great interests. I might take 1 week maximum to write the notes for one novel, but this collection, I reckon it was at least 5 weeks. Every afternoon, slaving away and trying. Have I got to the end of another essay? Oh no, it's the one about heresies. Heresies must have taken me 3 days.
I can imagine that heresies took
every other line. And yeah, I mean, thank goodness for the internet. It would not have been possible before the internet, or without a very large team of people from many, many disciplines. But with the internet, one can search quite intelligently and pull out a lot of data. But it was also trying to recognize quotations where her style of writing changed subtly. I think, oh, she's quoting here. I'll just lift that text, put it into my browser, and good Lord, is William Cowper again. Or, oh, Milton again. Paradise Lost, book 4 again. So patterns began to emerge, and that was very entertaining. And as I say, there were some texts I just kept going back to online again and again, because these were obviously the ones she drew from most. And that's where I discovered consonances with the earlier anthology, The Minor Pleasures of Life, because she definitely reused at least 3 of the quotations or sections in The Minor Pleasures of Life she quoted from extensively in Personal Pleasures. So not a huge amount of reworking, but there's a relationship there.
No, but I mean, this is the perquisite of being a writer, isn't it? To reuse your material in different ways.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
But the other thing is that not only does she quote, but she paraphrases as well. And I think that must have been even more difficult for you, actually.
It was, and I'm sure I've missed some, yeah. And I'm pretty positive that I'm going to get grumpy letters from people who studied Anglican theology because I will have misquoted or misattributed or got something completely wrong. I did try throughout to get at least 2 sources for each one. So quite often I would start with Wikipedia because that's the one that comes up first. And then I would use the resources in Wikipedia to do a secondary search and come at that quote from a different direction. But sometimes it wasn't possible. Sometimes it was just the source itself.
Yeah, well, I think you've done a fantastic job, I must say. I mean, it's really great. And, you know, one gets the impression that Rose was writing these essays and pulling down from her shelves all those old favourite books, some of the books that she'd inherited from her father, and books that had really kind of lived with her for 10, 20 years or even longer. And many of those books, of course, she lost.
Well, she must have lost them all.
When her flat was bombed during the war. So in a way, it's lovely to think of how she'd already used them, actually, in things like
I have not thought of this book in that sense before, and that's really clever. It's obviously not a memorial to all the books that burned in the Blitz, but yes, the idea that she was pulling down and using the full extent of her library, which was partly her father's library before her, that's really pleasing. So it's a summation, if you like, of things she valued most.
Yes, but then, of course, as well as looking up and quoting and using and paraphrasing older texts, she was a great one too for inventing new words, for neologisms. And, and you annotate those really nicely as well.
Well, they were easy to spot, because I've got a fairly wide knowledge of English because I studied it as a student and an academic and anyway. So if a word came up I did not recognize, straight to the Oxford Dictionary online, which is the authority. And time and again, good Lord, this word does not exist. It ought to exist. It looks legitimate. So I started keeping a list a running list of the words that Rose had completely invented. And I was so impressed by her because they're utterly plausible words. There's no reason why they shouldn't exist.
I mean, they're not words that you read and think, oh, what on earth does that mean?
No, that's true.
Because they sort of tell you what they mean.
Yeah, she uses the roots in the correct way. She follows the normal laws of linguistic evolution, if you like. So, yeah, they're lovely words. It's just that you might not want a word for that thing, but she's decided a word must exist. In a way, it's like a much earlier version of the calendars that not the 9 o'clock news used to issue in the 1980s and 90s. Do you remember these?
No, I don't. Tell me.
Not the 9 o'clock news, brilliant satirical BBC show.
Yes, I remember.
But every year they issued a tear-off calendar with a word, a completely made-up word, and its definition. So the one I remember best is the word. The definition was the sound when you pull the plastic cap off a milk bottle carton. There's that noise, and there's a word for it. And I mean, very light and silly and fun, and it was a novelty thing. But Rose was inventing words to fill a gap in the vocabulary that she thought needed to be filled.
Which isn't to say that these are difficult in any way. I mean, one wouldn't want people to think that the essays themselves, because they use sometimes archaic language or archaic old language anyway, and new words, that they're difficult, because they're not actually. I mean, they're very easy to read, aren't they?
They're just delightful.
They are, and I think that's partly because of the narrative voice that she uses, the persona that she presents. You talk about that a bit in your introduction.
Yeah.
So yes, I'd like you to tell us a bit more about the persona of the I in the essays, who's experiencing these pleasures or remembering them.
The I in the essay, the assumed, the narrative voice that Rose Macaulay created, is something like a very dotty but always curious and inquiring elderly friend, maybe not elderly, but certainly older than the person she is speaking to, who comes out with the most ridiculous things and the foolish and simplest questions that have to be explained. And she chatters, chat, and goes off into flights of fancy and wild extravagances of language, and then can also be very, very piercing and on the point and grotesquely tactless as well. And that's where the humor comes from, because she's such a funny voice. The essay about sitting in the cinema at night, which is, this is a 1930s cinema going experience, and it's just so true to life now before a pandemic, but also really, really funny, talking about how the film is constructed. Good Lord, what's that actor doing? How did they manage this? Yeah, it's so immediate and yet so very individual. Yeah, delightful.
A bit like the essay about going to plays as well, where where she suggests that plays shouldn't have intervals, because what do you do during the interval?
Yeah,
You want the play to carry on, and I do rather sympathise with that, I must say. But there's also this, it's something to do with the way that she suggests that she's letting you into something quite private. Well, I mean, they are called personal pleasures.
Yeah.
And yet there's something that is constructed as well about it, that is not saying this is really, really me.
Yeah.
Although I think there are bits of really, really me in the essays, but they are constructed as a writer constructs, a viewpoint, which is kind of the public face, really.
It is, yeah. And they're very careful to even if the essays go off on wild tangents, they always come back and they tie themselves in a neat bow, quite often with a joke or a witty aside. And you feel this is a complete whole, and it has been a delightful little journey. But it's, as you say, it's artificial, it's invented, and it's a construct. This is not the real Rose Macaulay. We'll never know what the real Rose Macaulay was like, but she delighted in making up this persona that she could speak to the public with.
Yeah, her public persona.
Yeah.
So there was something that struck me in the final essay, writing, and it's so appropriate that the final essay is called Writing, because that's kind of what it's all about, really. And she, if I can just quote this sentence: "Let me be amateur of verse and prose, dealing in fragments only." And then she makes a joke about, about how she can't be dealing in fragments only, or not so much a joke. I mean, she says, she is a professional writer, and earning her living as a novelist, as well as doing these, as well as writing in other forms too. But I mean, essentially as a novelist. And so, a novelist can't really just be writing in fragments of verse and prose the whole time. But it suddenly struck me that her love for fragments, I mean, it's like a little bit what you said earlier about ruins, and how her book Ruins has become, as you say, a cornerstone of ruins and investigating ruins. And it seems to me that she's saying something very kind of very true there, that she is attracted to fragments of things, and that this is partly what places her within what you might call the tradition of modernism, but also perhaps makes her voice seem very contemporary at times.
Yeah.
I mean, these are not old-fashioned things, even though some of them are about slightly old-fashioned things. Would you agree with that?
I do. No. I mean, I think she is a very good writer of the brief, immediate moment, and then that's it, ended off, dashed off. And some of the essays are only half a page long. Some are a little longer, perhaps 5 pages, which is a little more conventional. But she was completely happy writing the short thing, and also recording the brief and fleeting moment. And then that's all you need to say about the brief and fleeting moment, is just a very short piece. I'm not sure about the connection with modernism. I would resist putting Rose Macaulay into the modernist camp, mainly because I can't abide modernist writers. I find them extremely unreadable. But the spirit of the age cannot be avoided, so she would have absorbed the fashions for what modernism in literature and art and poetry were doing, and she would have responded to it, but she would just as equally have responded to the changing fashions in how films were made, and the new medium of radio. And in fact, I think she would have responded more avidly to the new technology rather than the new intellectual fashion.
Right. Okay. In fact, there is an essay called "Following the Fashion," isn't there, talking about that?
Yes. Yeah.
It produces some very nice parody of different forms of writing, different writing. And in fact, I think she says something rather about, oh, maybe I should go and write a novel of 1,000,000 words. And I'm thinking, oh, well, that sounds very contemporary, actually, Rose.
Yeah. And she does a terrific pastiche of T.S. Eliot and of Ernest Hemingway.
Sorry, what?
She does a terrific pastiche of T.S. Eliot poetry and Ernest Hemingway short story.
Hemingway too, yes. No, I mean, she's a mistress of pastiche, in fact.
Yes, very, very expert.
And a mistress of making things up too. So that last essay, Writing, I mean, it does seem to me that it's a very kind of important one for her. But also, I thought what was, looking at the collection as a whole, it begins with Abroad, and it ends with Writing. Can I just read you the first sentence of Abroad? Okay, so this is the first sentence of the book. I just think it's really funny.
Yeah.
Here we go. Yes. The great and recurrent question about abroad, with a capital A, is it worth the trouble of getting there? And that's a brilliant question to start off with, I think. But leaving that aside, I mean, it then seems to me that abroad and traveling and what abroad offered her in terms of, well, her childhood, but also her relationship with Gerald O'Donovan.
Yeah.
And later on, what she drew from her travels in Spain and in Portugal, that is a very strong, gives a very strong shape to her life. So at the one end we have abroad, and at the other end we have writing, and that those two together sort of encompass all the various diversions that go on in between.
Yes, I agree. It's a very well positioned endpoint. Yeah.